Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Hey, well, welcome everybody on the Advantage Podcast, and we've got a great guest today. Greg Sankey is with me, and Greg is the commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, and I actually met Greg back at the Global Leadership Summit in August this past year, and when I heard Greg was going to be at the summit, then I said I would love the opportunity to meet Greg. I have heard about Greg. Listen to him oftentimes on the ESPN different sportscast, and always hear the sportscasters actually talk about you, Greg, in very glowing terms for the most part. And so I thought, hey, this is somebody I'd love to meet. And so thank you for taking opportunity to, and allowing me to have the opportunity to talk with you today.
David, it was great to meet you. I appreciate your stepping into the leadership role with the Global Leadership Network and the opportunity for another conversation.
Yeah, no, this is great. I will say real quick, I don't know if you remember, but when we met, it was actually Friday morning. We had breakfast together. While we're having breakfast together, the whole Pac-12 kind of blew up. And so I would pass you in the hallway, kind of backstage the rest of the day during the summit, and you would be on the phone. And I'm guessing that, among other things, you were being interviewed on ESPN, but you might have been scrambling with the SEC as well. Who knows?
I remember the breakfast, but I actually remember the last time you walked by me in the hallway because there was a look on your face like, what's he doing? I was off to the side trying to find a quiet space. At that moment, I was on a phone call, a conference call with my board of directors, which is our university presidents and chancellors, updating them, kind of calming tensions, and painting a picture of what was happening around us. It had developed at the moment I saw you in the hallway, at least for me, over the preceding 24 hours. So my Global Leadership Summit enjoyment was disrupted by what was happening around me, not anything that I had done.
Yeah, well, that was quite the weekend, and it's one of those things that seems like everybody talked about possibly happening for a while, but I don't know that I ever thought it truly would. So pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting to be a part of thing. Someone asked me, I was for a time 20 plus years ago, commissioner of the Southland Conference, so kind of regional state universities in Texas and Louisiana. And then when I joined the SEC staff, I was once asked, my wife asked me at dinner one time, what's the difference between your job in the Southland Conference and your role in the Southeastern Conference? And literally, as she asked on the ESPN bottom line, there was a news story scrolling that had been part of a phone call I'd had that morning. I said, the difference is in my old job, I would never have a morning phone call that showed up on the ESPN bottom line. And literally now it happens with some regularity.
Exactly. People care more, it seems like, about what's going on in the Southeast Conference. So, well, a couple of things I'd love to ask you about, Greg. Let me give you a little more history, or give the guys more history as well. You went to college in New York and have a master's from Syracuse. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
And
yep.
I think I remember you saying when you were with the Southland Conference, and that was in Texas. So you lived outside of Dallas for a number of years as you were leading that. And what I need to ask you, and I probably shouldn't because you're going to give the wrong answer, but are you a Cowboy fan then because of your time in Dallas?
No, in fact, I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. I was born in Auburn, New York. So I grew up in central New York.
Okay.
And became a Buffalo Bills fan and still am. So the time I lived in Dallas was, Buffalo had those 4 Super Bowls, 2 of which were against the Dallas Cowboys, which, by halftime of those Super Bowl parties, I was ready to go.
Well, that wasn't the wrong answer then. As long as I was just afraid you were going to say the Eagles or something like that, but Bills we're okay with. So that's good. That's good. So family, you're married to Kathy and you have 2 daughters?
We do. 2 adult daughters, Hannah and Mariah.
Very good. And are they married or single, and any grandkids? Or
yeah, both married. So we've had an active family growth experience over the last 2 or 3 years. So our oldest daughter is a meteorologist.
Okay.
TV in Louisville. She and her husband were married in June of 21. And then our youngest daughter is a teacher. She and her husband live in Auburn, Alabama. And we became grandparents. Our oldest had our first granddaughter in July of this year. So
okay.
Got you fast is the phrase to be in an insurance commercial. True.
That's great. Well, good. Hey, so a couple things just so the guys know, and again, we're talking to pastors across Pennsylvania specifically, but one of the things I appreciate about you is you are a follower of Jesus, and I'm interested in just hearing how you talk about your faith when you're at work. I don't hear you proclaiming it, but I also don't hear you hiding from it either. And so I would assume that the people that work with you there at the SEC are pretty knowledgeable about your faith. And even as I've talked to you about other things, well, John Ortberg was our guest on our last podcast, and I know you said he's one of your favorites. And so I know that you've shared his book with others. You have some sayings on the wall that you picked up from the Global Leadership Summit. And so how do you deal with faith in the workplace? And part of my reason for asking, Greg, is, again, we're pastors, and we've got people like yourself and business leaders and community leaders in our churches. I know we in our minds have either expectations for people like you or what we hope people like you are doing, but how do you express your faith in your work situation?
I'll do my best to provide that answer, and let's agree to go back and I'll give you my short version of my Ortberg story to complement your last podcast and to complement John as well. My family changed when I was about 5 years old because of an encounter in the hospital between my dad and his doctor, who was a deacon in a Methodist church. And when I look at how life can alter, you can diverge on paths one way or another. The fact that I'm here is a tribute to the work of God in my family's life as a child, and I don't think that's something of which I should be ashamed. In fact, today I'll talk to student athletes. I often talk through my career path, and there are two little cards I give. One which is clearly faith-based, and that's my introduction to say, I'm happy to have this conversation. You can take this card and throw it away. You can take this card and think about it. You can take this card and ask me questions. So that's one way. When I started in this job as commissioner, I actually answered, well, who is Greg? And I walked through that change in my family from the late 60s, early 70s, and what that means for me today and how that's shaped me. Probably the right people to ask the question of is my staff and what I see. And I think that would be filled both with imperfections and acknowledgement of that faith basis. And I think we're working out our faith in some ways every day, is referenced in the New Testament.
But Greg, I know you bring some of your staff to the Leadership Summit each year, and then you don't just bring them; you'll have conversations after. And so, obviously, you're not out there. It's not a billboard on your shirt saying "I follow Jesus," but you're putting people in situations where they're having to encounter that anyway.
Well, I do, and our kind of approach to the summit has been an invitation where I disclose, hey, this is held at a church. There are going to be themes of faith. If you're not comfortable with that, just let me know. I'll be happy to give you a leadership growth opportunity in another setting. But I've brought folks who are involved in different denominations, some from a Jewish background, some who have no faith attachment. We've been open in those conversations. That then leads to the night before. We typically will have a dinner, depending on my travel schedule and theirs. And then the Thursday night is probably the most important conversation, because we'll have gone through day one, setting up day two. What did you learn? What did you hear? What do we need to talk about further? And I just think it's been a valuable opportunity to talk about leadership. One of the things I respect from our time in Scottsdale is we need not make leadership the idol, if you will, the center of this.
Right.
Christ is the center of the church, not leadership, and we should not lose sight of that. And so there's, with a group of people from different backgrounds, different questions, different conversations, but it's provided a bit of a safe place to have those conversations.
That's good.
Group and individually.
Yeah. So the other thing too, Greg, you're doing with that is you are developing leaders. And so is that something you're very intentional about? Because that's one of the struggles that pastors face, is just how do we get enough leaders in the church, and where are they? How do we find them? How do we develop them and grow them? So is that something that's intentional for you?
It is for me personally. And so on one of these little cards I give, which comes from this Ortberg experience, was the need to develop some principles on how I was going to make decisions for my life. That happened in the late 90s. And one of those statements, one of those principles is invest in myself. In other words, don't let my growth personally or as a leader be dependent on somebody else inviting me, asking me, guiding me. How do I seek those opportunities? That was actually, I was asked to attend. I was on a church leadership team in Plano, Texas, and invited to my first global leadership summit back in the summer of 2000. And in fact, one of the quotes that you walk in our back door every day, if you're a member of the staff, is from that summit. But from that, when I changed locations and wasn't invited, I invested in myself. And so I've shared that with my staff that first, you need to take responsibility for your own growth. Don't depend on me. But then we try to provide opportunities. And I try to do that as the leader here. Some growth and development opportunities. We have an emerging leaders group that I meet with quarterly. And it's, you guys just ask me how I make decisions. How do I look at what's ahead? Where did I stumble a bit before? It's a free-flowing conversation with probably half of our staff is in that emerging leaders as things continue to change.
Hey, Greg, so I love that you're doing that specifically, because sometimes I think we make developing leaders harder than it has to be. And I know that at least my experience is younger leaders want to have a seat at the table at some point. And so being able to sit down with you, I think, again, our fear, and sometimes we don't set up those kind of meetings because we think we have to have a presentation to make to them and we don't have time to prepare, where it's really just show up and ask questions. And you're just talking about your life experiences, right?
Yeah, so I've probably said it a number of times, but I was traveling here in 1997 to meet with the Southeastern Conference commissioner at that time, Roy Kramer, actually in this same physical space I'm occupying this interview. And on the trip, I had prepared, what did I want to ask the SEC commissioner? And so what I've said to our staff is every month they have an opportunity in our staff meeting, what we call Ask Greg Anything. And that's an open conversation. I didn't learn that early on in my career. I learned from press conferences that the media, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't know, could ask me anything. And I didn't give my staff that same opportunity. So every month in our staff meetings, there's Ask Greg Anything. And then I took that to our emerging leaders group and said, you know what, we're going to have lunch. I'm going to walk in, I'm going to eat lunch, and we'll block 2 hours generally. And we can stay 15 minutes or 2 hours. It's up to you. It's not up to me. So you have to be prepared and you have to ask. And one of the things I've done over the last 2 years is pivot. In fact, I have a reminder at our next staff meeting of their responsibility to prepare for that conversation like I did in 97, because coming here and meeting with the SEC commissioner, the Southeastern Conference commissioner, was huge for me. And I was a young conference commissioner. So take that opportunity, use that illustration for yourself. Even though you see me every day and I dress more casually than my predecessors, understand you got an opportunity to gain some insight and some hopefully growth through that conversation.
Yeah, that's great. You're a quarter zip guy when you talk about dressing, right? Lots of quarter zips I've seen you wear, which I like.
Preferred piece of attire.
That's good. So one of the other things that I appreciate very much about you, not only are you a follower of Jesus, you're also a church guy. And so part of your story, at least as I remember, was you talked about being in a church in Dallas. Actually, when we had breakfast, the two of us, with a friend of yours that you had met in church in Dallas when you were in your late 20s, still friends now, but still very much involved in church. So where does church fit into your life and as a family life and things like that? Again, talking to pastors, and it's fun for pastors to hear that somebody like you would think, church is important.
Yeah, so, maybe a few observations and a few challenges. One is, I shared a story from the Peach Bowl a year ago, which went better than the Rose Bowl this year for my team when Georgia beat Ohio State had finished at midnight. We had traveled back, and Kathy and I were walking into church, and she overheard these two guys walking alongside us, said, "See, I told you he'd be here today," which was about my attending after that game. I never would have imagined my presence being a topic of conversation. Now, I will confess, this past Sunday, we had a little bit of a problem on a Saturday basketball game that caused me to be in here trying to problem solve. And so I missed. And so it is, to the extent it can be, a priority. I think one of the observations for me is when you're in one of these high visibility, high intensity leadership positions, the church schedule doesn't necessarily fit your schedule. And
Yeah.
since you have so many pastors, I would encourage them in two ways. One, how do you meet people in these roles, maybe where they are a little bit? The church is good at doing some things in that capacity for those in need. Don't miss that people in leadership roles are in need too, just different ways, and they can serve. And the second is, these things can be lonely. I think you've lived that. I just finished reading your book, and there are stories of those moments where you're sitting there a bit alone trying to figure out, what was I thinking, right? And how can the church come alongside leaders, particularly those committed to their faith? And the book before I read was Pat Gelsinger talking about his role in his church, which outpaces me, and that's pretty remarkable given his role as the CEO of Intel, but very inspirational. If I was going to make a book recommendation, since I'm with you, I'll put yours first and put Pat's.
Thank you. Good choice. Yeah.
Pat's second, but an inspiration about somebody in a high level leadership position, fully engaged in their faith walk.
So let's talk about that just for a second, Greg. You're incredibly busy. I think the last time you and I talked, it was in October, maybe November, Scottsdale, Arizona, and you had gone to a friend's wedding on Friday night. You flew Saturday morning to I think it was Texas OU weekend, and then you went to Texas A&M and was at Alabama that night, and then you flew back to some kind of reception in Austin that night. So all that to say, you're incredibly busy. There's not a lot of openings in your schedule, I'm guessing.
There were not in the fall. That's absolutely true. And this is right or wrong, it's a 7-day-a-week role, and you try to put gaps. In fact, that 2-day experience in Scottsdale for me was incredibly refreshing. And as I moved to the conclusion of football season, I actually was a much better mental frame of mind, and from just a health and rest and vigor, that more so than I remember being in my preceding 8 seasons. And one of those lessons is, how do you grab time, even though I'm busy, being intentional about taking some moments. And actually this week we had 3 days of our athletics directors meeting, and I had a conversation with one of our key leaders, and he said, I went to my university president and said, I can't work at the same pace I did 10 years ago. I think it's incredibly valuable, and I'm going to have to schedule just a little bit of time here and there. And one of the challenges in the pastorate, having worked as the chair of a leadership team and a deacon chair, and seeing some really, really effective pastoral leaders, is forget my intensity, the intensity at which our church leaders work. And I've heard so much in the post-COVID era of the challenges, and you're dealing with the cultural issues of discontent. I would describe, my encouragement is, you just have to step away. You're just going to have to schedule those moments. And I need to explain the Ortberg thing, so I'll finish this question.
Okay, good.
You need to come back, because one of my learnings early in my life was how to try to find that rhythm of a highly intense work, but then the ability to step away and refresh and re-energize myself.
Yeah, that's good. And so you as a leader, you talked about being involved as a board chair, deacon chair in your church. So one of the things that we're told as pastors all the time is we've got people like yourself in our churches, and the comment that's always made to us is, all we'll ask you to do is hand out brochures or bulletins or usher at the doors, and that's about as high level of a role we give you. And so I think we struggle knowing how busy you are, what roles can we ask you to step into. And so how do we approach somebody like you? What would you tell pastors to do to approach somebody like you, to be able to challenge you with your skills, but also be real cognizant of the pressures that you're under as well, just in your job.
Well, my time, it was in Plano, is the chair of those two groups. I was in my early 30s, and the deacon chair experience was pretty funny because I was voted by the body as this role. I'm like, what in the world? How can this be me? And then I went to an event where I just happened to be seated next to a fellow deacon chair. It happened to be the deacon chair from First Baptist Church of Dallas. And he was basically citing what he does for his work. I was commissioner of the Southland Conference. He knew a little bit about it. And I walked away. I'm like, how in the world am I chairing a deacon group compared to this guy's resume? I would say, in direct answer to your question, two things. One, you have to ask. And my experience is folks in these roles are so under scrutiny, under demand. You have to ask. And then when you ask, you have to follow through. And over the arc of my experience, the follow through may be harder than the ask. Having been asked a number of times and had expectations to step into a conversation, that follow through is more important than the ask. So ask, and then follow through, and then, prepare to walk together, because, time is a commodity. And that's the challenge we spoke about, from rest and recovery for those in pastoral leadership roles. It's the same for us in whether it's business or athletics and sports or education, whatever it may be. Ask and follow through.
I think that's great, because again, Greg, I think our tendency is to be fearful of, we will give the answer for you. Instead of asking you, we in our minds assume you're going to say no, or assume that you can't or won't do something. And so we never ask the question. So I think that's great. And I think the follow through, like you said, that's incredibly important, because otherwise there's an opportunity we might miss if we don't follow through with that. So that's fantastic.
Well, and there's a response for me. So I was asked to go on a trip to the Middle East with a group from our faith body. And when I was asked, I'm like, why are you asking me? And the individual asked had an answer, and I said, okay, what is this going to mean? And the follow through was like major league. Now, the day we had gone through some stuff that year, and I'm sitting on the bus going to the Atlanta airport thinking, what in the world am I doing? And, phones work, and, 10 hours away, and you could make it work. But had the person not asked, I never would have done that.
Yeah.
To sit with those serving in that region and hear from them was more encouraging to me than anything I could do for them. And it was all about the ask and the follow through.
That's great. So you're a follower of Jesus, you're a church guy. I love that. You're also a sports guy, which I enjoy that very much as well. And so one of the stories I was telling you when we were together before, I went to Texas Tech University, so I'm more of a Big 12 guy. So honestly, I've always been frustrated with the SEC, because you guys, I don't even want to admit that you may be better than us, but you probably are. And so that's always been an interesting one. But I went to with my family, we were visiting family in Dallas from Pennsylvania. It happened to be January 1st. We're driving through from Houston to Dallas. Cotton Bowl was going on. Texas Tech was playing Mississippi in the Cotton Bowl. So this was probably back in the, 2010s or earlier than that even.
The game. Yep.
Yeah. And so we played a good game, but Mississippi pulls it out in the last 4 or 5 minutes. And all of a sudden the crowd starts doing this very obnoxious thing that I've never heard before, where they start chanting SEC, SEC. And I'm like, what in the world are they doing? Because we would never chant Big 12. If another Big 12 team loses, we would cheer that. Whereas the Mississippi fans were cheering for the conference. And I was telling you how obnoxious that was. And if I remember right, you said you might have been the one that kind of got that whole thing started.
Well, yeah, no, I remember the first time I heard it. We used that in our ad campaign. So
okay.
One of the PR firms I consulted said to me, never apologize.
Yeah.
We are. And fans actually started. So the first time I ever heard it, and I think it's attributed to a different game, was in Tampa. It was a basketball game. Auburn's men's basketball team had won to advance to the Sweet 16. I think in 2003, and the crowd started chanting. And so I've heard those moments. I was not commissioner at the time, but I was at the game.
Okay.
My family and I would regularly attend the Cotton Bowl, given our relationships in Dallas. But if you watch one of our 30-second spots, that's how we end. And
Yes, I've heard
we've
that. And
done,
it's,
yeah, we've done some Olympic advertising this year where we morph from USA to SEC. We're fortunate that it kind of rolls off the tongue. Chanting Big 12 is not
doesn't
quite.
sound the same. Well, I will tell you that as obnoxious as it was back at that game, it's equally obnoxious when I see it on the commercials now. So it hits me the same way. But
Sometimes we lose and fans chant it aggressively towards us, and I take that as a compliment.
exactly. So this has nothing. Well, actually, it does have something to do with leadership. You talked about Saturday. You had something going on with a basketball game that you had to attend to, and it probably wasn't this, but I remember reading in the sports over the last week. Being from Texas, everybody is down. If you don't go to the University of Texas, you're against the University of Texas. And so you guys just brought them into the SEC. One of the things that I've been reading over the last several weeks is coaches getting upset about the horns down signal that some of the opposing schools are giving. And as a growing up in Texas and as going to a different school in Texas, that's just a way of life. That's what we do that all the time. And so it's almost funny to see everybody reacting so strongly to it. But as a leader of the conference, do you get involved in something like that? And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think of it as being just a very minute thing that I'm not sure how you can even control that. But how do you decide as a leader what things to get involved with and what not? And is that something lower than what you get involved in, or is that something you jump into and make comment on?
Probably imperfectly, depending on what one's perspective. So I've not been engaged in that particular issue since they're not members. We do have expectations that motion. So we have a gator chomp. One of our schools kind of has a shark fin thing. We have other gestures that not be done at opponents.
Yeah. Okay.
That's one of the lines. We have sportsmanship issues that will generate phone calls. We had a circumstance in a men's basketball game a few weeks ago that resulted in a public reprimand of a coach. I don't like doing those things, but there are times when something is of a nature that it requires that type of engagement. Sometimes there are suspensions. One of the things that we have to figure out in college sports is the professional sports do a lot of fining, and that's a way to have a slap on the wrist. We don't really have that for participants because of the nature of our participants, our students who are athletes as well. But yeah, I'm engaged in it. I would like to do less rather than more, and we want the process of oversight and accountability to integrate with growth and education too. And I think that can be by the public when one fan base just wants something punitive and the other wants you to just walk away.
Yeah. So you talk about the people you're working with. I mean, you're working with leaders. So, you think through the coaches, even just let's limit it just to football in the Southeast Conference. And you've got all these strong personalities. They're the public side. And then I'm sure you're dealing with the presidents of the universities, that's more of a private thing. How do you deal with leading all these leaders? And at least on the football side, I'm sure on the president's side, there's big egos as well. And so you're trying to manage and move forward and herd this group of strong personalities. And not unlike maybe in a church situation where we don't have control over the volunteers of the people in the church. We've got to do what we can to persuade them and guide them and then hope they choose to follow. But how do you manage that?
Well, first of all, let me offer that my father-in-law is a retired church pastor.
Okay.
So other churches, generally in the Northeast, up in central New York, and then in Northern Virginia, some in Florida. So I had the chance to observe that personally, and then serving in leadership roles. Yeah, we all have big personalities, and in my arena, literally, those big personalities show up on TV and in interview rooms and in newspapers. The advantage I have, or one of the benefits of my job, is people who are in coaching roles that are seen either from fans sitting in the stands or by those watching TV. I come to know them. Nick Saban just announced his retirement from coaching.
Yeah.
I gave Nick a couple of days and then we talked for 10 minutes. We've known each other for over 20 years, believe it or not.
Yeah.
I have new coaches, so I don't know. Kalen DeBoer just stepped into Alabama. We'll
Yeah.
come to know him. I've called some coaches and just said, hey, how are you doing? I would transfer that to say, we are in a relational activity, whether it's in what I do or what church leaders do. And you're going to have to figure out the unique characteristics of each of your leaders, each of your volunteers. In a church that you had built up of tens of thousands, you're not going to know everybody, but you're going to have to figure out how to invest your time. You're going to have to multiply your leadership through your staff and empower them. And I'm much better at that post-COVID, by the way, than I was pre-COVID. Where
is that right?
Is my leadership team understands their authority is much broader than it would have been in 2017. They have the opportunity to resolve issues before they ever come to me. And
That's good.
Church leaders are going to have to figure out that same authority, but it's going to go back to that relational basis, getting to actually know people. And you know what I find is people are really good at knowing whether you're just playing the game or you're interested in them. So
Yeah.
how do you show that genuine care and interest, even in my role, spread across, dozens and dozens of coaches and 21 different sports on soon to be 16 different campuses.
Yeah, that's good. So we'll kind of maybe start wrapping up on that one, Greg. You mentioned Nick Saban. One of the things I appreciate about him, so I'm not an Alabama fan, but what I appreciate about Nick is his whole mantra of do your job, do the little things, do them over and over and over. And I think sometimes as pastors, we get bored with doing the little things. And I'm sure that's in every walk of life. And yet the consistency and the redundancy of just doing those little things is probably what brings a lot of our success, I would imagine. You do some little things that I appreciate very much, and one is writing notes. And you are, I don't know if anybody else knows it, but you're notorious at writing notes to people. And I remember the first time I talked to you at that breakfast, and 3 or 4 days later, in the midst of all the blow up of the Pac-12 and whatever else you're doing, I get a handwritten note from you saying, thanks for meeting with me for breakfast. And I know that happens over and over. And how did you start that? And why is that important to you?
Goes back a few decades that I would receive a note from time to time and just realize the impact. In fact, right over here is a handwritten note from John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach who was legendary. I had the chance to meet him in 2001. I had read a number of books about him. We were seated at a Final Four across the aisle from each other on Saturday. I brought the book I'd read called Be Quick But Don't Hurry by one of his former players. I just wrote that former player a note. I finally accessed his home address.
Oh.
And I gave Coach Wooden a 2-page handwritten letter to just say, thank you for your example. And here's how I've learned from watching you. And, a week later, a handwritten note from John Wooden, which is framed in my office, arrived. And that was a pretty good lesson that of the impact. So I will confess to being a little bit behind. I caught up a bit. I wrote a couple dozen last weekend and have that same goal this weekend. And that may be to someone who helped me. It may be from someone who handed me a card that I met. I have fans who write angry notes, and if they're not profane or insulting, I'll write them back, even if they're mad about scheduling or officiating or playoff selection. I'll send them a note back, and sometimes they write back and they're still angry. A few times they'll write back and say, I never would have imagined you would have written or written a note, and just a habit I formed, thought it was impactful to me, and have tried to be better and better about it all the time, because I think it does convey a level of care and intentionality that can be lost when we're used to text messages and emails.
And I think you told me you just carry cards with you or note cards with you, and then whenever you have opportunity, you just send them out.
Yeah, you can see that my desk, since we're on video, is not terribly clean, so that's part of it. But this is my little leather pouch and my note cards to be written that have been written to me, and that goes with me on the road a lot more than I don't always write letters on the road, but it does travel with me.
That's great. Well, I know that's very convicting to me, and I think, oh, I'm too busy to do that kind of thing, even though I've heard over and over how important it is. And so for somebody like yourself to do that, I think that's amazing. Well, Greg, thank you for taking time with us, and we'll enjoy. Hopefully, the guys will enjoy listening for you on different shows. I think one of the shows that I hear you often on is Paul Feinbaum, and I remember the first time I heard Paul and thought, "Who is this guy?" And yet he's somewhat addictive to listen to, even though he is probably your best SEC spokesperson on the radio. But he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, you texted me this fall after you have my cell number after hearing me. And I saw Paul a week or so later, and I said, "Hey, if you wonder about your reach," I said, "there's this guy, Pennsylvania, sometime in Chicago, and was listening to our conversation and sent me a text. So you do have that impact." If I could just give one piece of context, which I think is instructional, and I'm over time, so your editors can help. I've referenced the impact of John Ortberg's
Yes.
writings upon me. So I told you about 1997, I was traveling to visit in this office with Roy Kramer, the SEC's commissioner. I flew from Dallas to Atlanta. I exited the plane. I went in the restroom and I passed out while using the restroom standing up. So you can use your imagination there. I can remember someone saying, "It's fine, sir. We've called the paramedics, stay on the ground," and wondering, like, who are they talking to? And realizing that my cheek was about a half-inch off of the bathroom floor, which one of the principles in life is if you're getting up off a bathroom floor, you're not in a healthy place. And I had developed an irregular heartbeat, an atrial fibrillation that put me down. First time and only time it's happened, thankfully. And I spent the next 6 months visiting with leaders in my sphere in the Dallas area, trying to figure out how to balance my life and all kinds of notes. I paid for lunches. And then I went into a bookstore, which is a habit, but I don't often just respond to titles. And there's this book called The Life You've Always Wanted. And I could see the name Ortberg on the spine. So for like 1995, I could learn about the life I've always wanted. And so I'd spent 6 months trying to figure out how to balance my work and my home, my work life and my family life. And it's interesting that we always talk about work-life balance, and work always comes first, which should be a little bit of a check. And so I read that book, and in the 12th chapter, there's what I'll paraphrase is Ortberg says, "Don't chase balance in life. It's an insufficient goal." And just I'd spent 6 months trying to figure it out. And so what he talked about is, how you're going to make decisions, what are the principles that are going to guide you. And I've talked about these little cards. And so I started writing, and it took me 5 years to actually put down from that book the challenge of what principles are going to guide my life. And that's where the invest in myself, make each day a masterpiece, limit my exposure to temptation, never be the source of hurt in the eyes of my wife or my children. And I also learned from that I needed a rhythm. Like every 2 months, I could go really hard, but I needed to step away for a day or two and refresh myself and think and rest. And I referenced that earlier in our podcast, and just given the compliment of you having had John on before. I once stood in a prayer line at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church when he was leading there just to say thank you. And I said, "Look, I'm not making a prayer request. Like violating all church protocol to say thank you for the impact on my life." And one of the notes I wrote my first day in this job as Southeastern Conference Commissioner was to John. And then there were 5 or 6 others where I said, I've ascended to this position, not because of me, but because of all the people that have helped guide me. And you did this from afar. And I hope as church leaders, that story and the investment in your leaders, your leadership, taking a break, figuring out who you are, can be communicated by me because of the impact and the benefit I received from a tough moment, getting up off a bathroom floor, encountering just this little book, The Life You've Always Wanted. And I've shared that over and over, and have heard from a variety of different people of how it's impacted them. And maybe bought a couple dinners for John and Nancy along the way from book.
That's great. Actually, I sent him, you sent a little note to me as we were preparing for this podcast. And so I sent him a copy of your comments of how much you appreciated him. And so he was very thankful for those. And had you even heard of John before when you picked up that book? Did you know the name Ortberg or?
No, because that would have been 98. I'd never been to the
Yeah.
summit, no idea who he was. And then, back in the first time I attended, there used to be a Saturday session, and
Yeah.
John might fill the Friday afternoon or the Saturday session. And whenever he was Saturday morning, I was sure sometimes I was on video at a distance, one time in person. And that was a big deal. When I traveled for business, when he was leading the church out in Menlo Park, Kathy and I, a couple of times, and myself a couple of times, made sure that we scheduled the chance to go listen and learn in that.
Yeah. That's great. And, it's interesting, your rhythm of needing every 2 months or so time away. I found that probably the last 10 years that I was at LCBC Church, where I needed to know every 6 or 8 weeks that there was something that I could look forward to get away for a couple of weeks. And I always would try to think through, am I just trying to escape or what am I doing? But it was necessary to know that it was on my calendar for me to keep going and working hard. So.
Yeah. And it used to be that I would use maybe some work things where I could step away. I might be on a trip, schedule a day.
Right.
Or at the end, or where I could gather that time. Now, for what I do now, from Labor Day till the first week of December is football season. You can't just step away. So as I told you, the benefit for me attending the Global Leadership Network event in Scottsdale was it was just mental refreshment and some physical refreshment. Even though I wasn't away, that was incredibly beneficial. Couple of days that I hadn't even considered in that fashion before I attended.
That's great. Greg, thank you. I appreciate you so much and appreciate the way you just live Jesus in front of people in a very natural way, and appreciate your attention to detail and relationships. And so thank you. Thank you for speaking into the lives of our Pennsylvania pastors, and we'll enjoy watching for you hopefully in positive ways when it comes to sports and Paul Feinbaum and everybody else that you're talking to. So thank you for taking time with us.
Thank you, David. It's been great to visit today, and I appreciate this new relationship, and I hope this has been beneficial to those listening.
I'm sure very much so. Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.